The Mark 49 torpedo was killing more American submariners than the Japanese ever could. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey stood in the conning tower of USS Barb, staring at a problem that had no official solution. 3 fish, 3 perfect shots at a Japanese convoy, 3 duds that clanked harmlessly against enemy hulls before sinking into the black water of the Pacific. His crew had done everything right: the approach, the calculations, the firing solution. Everything except trust the weapon the Navy had given them. It was August 1944, and submariners across the Pacific Fleet were dying because their torpedoes wouldn't explode. The Mark 14 had been in service since 1931. 13 years of catastrophic failure, wrapped in layers of bureaucratic denial. The magnetic exploder was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back without ever making contact. Revolutionary technology, except it didn't work. The contact exploder was supposed to trigger on impact as a backup, except it didn't work either. Torpedoes ran too deep. They ran in circles. They exploded prematurely or not at all. American submarines were making perfect attacks and getting nothing but the metallic clank of failure. And the Navy kept saying the problem was the crews. Fluckey knew better. Every submarine commander in the Pacific knew better. They'd been filing reports since 1942, detailed documentation of failure after failure. The torpedo station at Newport kept insisting the weapon was fine. Bureau of Ordnance kept insisting the weapon was fine. Meanwhile, Japanese convoys sailed past American submarines that had expended their entire load of defective fish. Men were dying for nothing. USS Wahoo had been lost with all hands. Tang, Harder, Growler, good boats with good crews, sent to the bottom, partly because they couldn't sink the enemy when it mattered. You can't fight a war when your primary weapon is as dangerous to you as it is unreliable against the enemy. So the submarine force started doing something the Navy had explicitly forbidden. They started fixing the torpedoes themselves. It began quietly. A conversation in a wardroom. A chief torpedo man who'd worked in ordnance before the war. Someone who understood the physics of what was supposed to happen versus what was actually happening. The magnetic exploder was the first thing to go. Too sensitive, too unreliable, triggering on the Earth's magnetic field instead of a ship's hull. Submariners started deactivating it, relying solely on contact detonation. The Navy said that was unauthorized modification of ordnance. Submariners kept doing it anyway. Then they discovered the contact exploder had its own fatal flaw. The firing pin wasn't strong enough. A torpedo hitting a ship at the 90-degree angle they'd been trained to shoot would strike so squarely that the firing pin couldn't move far enough to trigger detonation. The harder you hit, the less likely it was to explode. It was almost mathematically perfect incompetence. Chief torpedomen started machining new parts, strengthening firing pins, adjusting mechanisms, modifications that would get them court-martialed if discovered. They did it anyway, because the alternative was sending boys out to die with broken weapons. Fluckey wasn't just modifying torpedoes, he was hunting a different way entirely. Barb had become something the Navy had never intended, a surface raider that happened to be able to dive. He'd figured out that if you couldn't rely on torpedoes, you found other ways to kill the enemy. Deck guns, rockets. He'd even considered ramming before his XO talked him out of it. But the modified Mark XIVs were working now. Finally. Reliably. His crew had turned Bureau of Ordnance's embarrassment into something lethal. The brass wanted to pretend the modifications weren't happening, until USS Barb started sinking everything it touched. 1944 became a different kind of war for American submarines. Word spread through the fleet about which modifications worked. Chiefs talked to chiefs. Commanders compared notes in Pearl Harbor between patrols. The unofficial network of submarine force innovation turned the Mark 14 from a liability into the weapon it should have been from the start. Japanese shipping started disappearing at catastrophic rates. Fluckey took Barb into the Sea of Okhotsk in June 1945. Waters no American submarine had operated in before. Too shallow, too dangerous, too close to the Japanese homeland. He didn't ask permission because he knew what the answer would be. He just went. Barb slipped through minefields and coastal patrols into what the Japanese thought was safe water. It wasn't safe anymore. He found a convoy on June 23rd. 30 ships, maybe more, hugging the coastline. Supply vessels bringing resources south to feed the war machine. Fluckey waited until dark, surfaced, and charged straight into the middle of them. Barb's modified torpedoes started launching, one after another. The night erupted with explosions as ships began dying. The Japanese couldn't believe an American submarine was operating in those waters, let alone making a surface attack inside their defensive perimeter. Barb sank ship after ship. Modified fish running hot, straight, and normal, exploding exactly as they were supposed to. The modifications the Navy had forbidden were working perfectly. Flucky emptied his tubes, turned Barb around, and disappeared back into the darkness before the Japanese could organize an effective response. But he wasn't done. He'd noticed something during that attack, a railroad track running along the coast, the Karafuto Railway, carrying coal and supplies from Japanese-occupied territory. Flucky started thinking about something no submarine commander had ever attempted. He was going to blow up a train. The idea was absolutely insane. Submarines don't conduct land operations. They don't send shore parties into enemy territory. They don't plant demolitions on railroad tracks. Except Flucky had stopped caring about what submarines were supposed to do. He cared about what would hurt the enemy most effectively. He assembled a landing party, 8 men. 55 pounds of Torpex explosives scavenged from one of those modified Mark IV torpedoes everyone was pretending didn't exist. A microswitch trigger mechanism that would detonate when a train passed over it. They rehearsed the operation aboard Barb until everyone knew their role perfectly. On July 23rd, Barb surfaced 1,000 yards off the Karafuto coast at 0200 hours. The landing party went over the side in a rubber raft. Flucky waited, Barb's engines idling, ready to dive if Japanese patrol boats appeared. 25 minutes. That's how long his men would have to get ashore, locate the railroad, plant the charge, and get back. They made it in 22. The charge was set with a pressure trigger beneath the tracks. Simple. Reliable. The kind of thing that would work exactly once before the Japanese figured out what had happened. But once was all Flucky needed. The landing party made it back to Barb. Flucky ordered the boat to submerge to periscope depth. They waited. 1 hour. 2 hours. Nothing. Maybe the charge was a dud. Maybe a Japanese patrol had found it. Maybe... The explosion lit up the night sky at 0450. Through the periscope, Flucky watched a 16-car Japanese freight train disintegrate. The locomotive derailed, cars jackknifed, the whole thing tumbling down an embankment in a cascade of destruction. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition or fuel in some of those cars. The only submarine in history to sink a train had just done exactly that. Barb's crew cheered, quietly, because they were still in enemy waters, but they cheered. Flucky pointed Barb toward open ocean and home. The Navy had a problem now. USS Barb had become the most successful submarine of the war. Flucky had sunk more enemy tonnage than almost anyone afloat. He'd conducted operations the brass said were impossible. He'd done it using modified torpedoes the Bureau of Ordnance insisted were unauthorized. They couldn't court-martial him. He was a hero, so they pretended the modifications had been authorized all along. By late 1945, the submarine force was officially using modified Mark XIV torpedoes. The magnetic exploder was gone. The contact mechanism was strengthened. The depth-setting problem was fixed. Everything submariners had been doing illegally for 2 years became standard procedure. The Navy issued technical bulletins describing modifications as if they'd come from Newport instead of from chiefs with micrometers and submarine tenders across the Pacific. Nobody mentioned the men who died before those modifications became official. The final accounting was brutal. American submarines comprised less than 2% of the Navy, but sank 55% of all Japanese shipping lost in the war. 1,600 Japanese vessels sent to the bottom, but 52 American submarines were lost. 3,500 men who never came home. Some of those boats died because of enemy action they couldn't avoid. Some died because their torpedoes didn't work when they needed them to. USS Tang went down because one of her own torpedoes malfunctioned, ran circular, and hit her. Even the modifications couldn't fix every problem with a fundamentally flawed weapon. Flucky brought Barb home in August 1945. He'd completed 12 war patrols, sank 17 confirmed vessels, and damaged many more. His crew had conducted the only successful shore raid by submarine forces in the Pacific Theater. They'd sunk the only train in history destroyed by submarine action. And they'd done it using weapons that had been modified in violation of regulations because the regulations were killing American sailors. He received the Medal of Honor in March 1946. The citation mentioned his aggressive tactics and innovative thinking. It didn't mention that his innovations included illegally modifying his primary weapon system because the Navy had spent 13 years denying there was a problem. The Mark XIV saga became a case study in institutional failure. How bureaucracy can kill more effectively than the enemy. How the gap between official policy and field reality can be measured in lives lost. The torpedo itself wasn't the real problem. The real problem was a system that punished the people trying to fix it. 7 U-boats were eventually sunk using intelligence gathered from modified American torpedoes that worked reliably enough to be tested in controlled conditions. The data submariners collected through unauthorized modifications helped the Navy understand what was failing and why. That information got shared with Allied anti-submarine forces. British and American destroyer crews hunting German submarines benefited from modifications Pacific submariners had made to weapons that weren't supposed to need modification. The war ended before anyone could be punished for saving it. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Bureau of Ordnance never officially admitted the Mark 14 was defective when issued. The closest they came was a series of technical modifications issued between 1943 and 1945 that corrected problems they'd previously insisted didn't exist. The magnetic exploder that worked perfectly was quietly discontinued. The contact mechanism that needed no adjustment was completely redesigned. The depth control that was accurate was recalibrated. Every change matched exactly what submarine crews had been reporting since 1942. The men who'd been filing those reports weren't vindicated. They were just proven right too late to save the boats that had been lost. Flucky understood something the bureaucrats didn't. War is about adapting faster than the enemy, about taking calculated risks, about trusting the men doing the fighting more than the men doing the paperwork. Barb's success wasn't just about one commander's brilliance. It was about empowering a crew to solve problems at the lowest possible level. Chiefs modifying torpedoes, radio men improving communication systems, lookouts developing better search patterns. Every man on that boat thinking about how to fight more effectively instead of waiting for official solutions that might never come. That's why Barb survived when 52 other submarines didn't. The submarine force learned to trust its people more than its procedures. They learned that sometimes the right answer is the unauthorized one, that regulations written in peacetime might not apply in war, that the men closest to the problem usually know the solution before the men furthest from it will admit there's a problem. Those lessons got men killed before they were learned. That's the part that sticks. The modified Mark 14 eventually became one of the most effective weapons of the Pacific War. Japanese shipping losses climbed steadily from 1943 onward as American submarines finally had reliable torpedoes. The economic strangulation of Japan accelerated. Resources stopped flowing. The home islands started starving. Submarines did what surface ships and aircraft couldn't. They cut the supply lines that kept Japan fighting. But it took 2 years longer than it should have, because the weapon didn't work, and the people responsible wouldn't listen. Eugene Flucky retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral in 1972. He'd spent 28 years in service, most of it underwater. He never spoke much about the torpedo modifications. Didn't have to. Everyone who served in submarines during the war knew the story. They'd lived it. The official histories could say whatever they wanted. The men who'd been there knew the truth. Barb was decommissioned in 1954, sold for scrap in 1955. The submarine that had sunk a train, that had raided enemy harbors, that had survived because her crew refused to accept that their weapons were good enough when they demonstrably weren't. She was cut apart and melted down, turned into bridge steel and rebar. Nothing left but the memory of what she'd done and the men who'd done it. The last surviving Barb crew member passed away in 2018. With him went the living memory of what it felt like to know your torpedo might kill you instead of the enemy. What it felt like to modify weapons in secret. Knowing discovery meant court-martial. What it felt like to watch those modifications work, to see enemy ships finally exploding the way they were supposed to, and know that the brass would keep pretending everything had been fine all along. 7 U-boats at the bottom of the Atlantic because modified American torpedoes finally worked well enough to gather the data needed to kill them. Hundreds of Japanese ships at the bottom of the Pacific for the same reason. Thousands of American submariners who came home because someone had the courage to fix a weapon the Navy insisted wasn't broken. That's the legacy of the illegal mod, not the ships sunk or the medals earned. The legacy is simpler than that. Sometimes the most lethal weapon isn't the one in the manual. It's the willingness to trust the men doing the fighting more than the men writing the regulations, to adapt, to innovate, to take responsibility for solving problems even when solving them violates every rule in the book. The submarine force learned that lesson in blood and seawater. 52 boats that didn't come back, 3,500 men lost, some of them because the enemy was good, some of them because their own weapon wasn't good enough and the people responsible wouldn't admit it. The ones who made it home carried that knowledge forward. They built a navy that listened to its sailors, that encouraged innovation, that understood the difference between peacetime procedure and wartime necessity. The modern submarine force exists because men like Fluckey and the chiefs who modified his torpedoes refused to accept failure as acceptable just because it was official. That's the real story, not the train, not the Medal of Honor, not even the ships sunk. The story is about the distance between what you're told will work and what actually does, about the courage it takes to bridge that gap when bridging it could destroy your career, about the crews who did it anyway because they valued mission success over personal safety. The Bureau of Ordnance wanted submariners to trust the Mark the 14th. Submariners wanted a torpedo that worked. Those two things were mutually exclusive until someone had the courage to say the regulations were wrong. 7 U-boats learned that lesson the hard way. So did every Japanese ship that exploded the way it was supposed to after 1943. The weapon worked fine once it was fixed. The tragedy is how long it took to fix it. How many men died in the gap between problem identified and solution authorized. The modified torpedoes weren't just more lethal to the enemy. They were less lethal to the crews firing them. That's what made them illegal and necessary at the same time. The Navy couldn't officially authorize them without admitting the original weapon was flawed, but they couldn't win the war without them. So they looked the other way, while submariners fixed the problem themselves. That unofficial arrangement saved lives and sank ships. It also created a precedent, a recognition that sometimes the book answer isn't the right answer. That field experience matters more than laboratory testing. That the men whose lives depend on a weapon working get final say on whether it works. The submarine force never forgot that. Every torpedo tube on every American submarine today carries the legacy of chiefs in 1943 with micrometers and modified firing pins, making unauthorized changes to weapons that were killing American sailors. The legacy of commanders who looked at regulations and mission success and chose mission success. The legacy of crews who understood that sometimes illegal and necessary are the same thing. That's why the Navy banned the most lethal weapon of the war, because it only became lethal after submariners made it that way, and admitting that meant admitting 13 years of failure. Easier to ban the modifications, let submariners keep making them anyway, then quietly authorize everything after the fact. The Pacific submarine campaign succeeded despite the weapon it was given, not because of it. That's the truth the official histories don't quite say. They talk about torpedo improvements and technical modifications. They don't talk about chiefs violating regulations in machine shops on submarine tenders. They don't talk about commanders who knew they were risking court-martial every time they authorized another mod. They just talk about the ships that were sunk and the war that was won. But the men who were there knew the cost, knew which boats went down before the modifications became standard, knew which crews died with torpedo rooms full of fish that wouldn't explode, knew the difference between the weapon they were given and the weapon they created. That knowledge died with them, mostly. The last voices that could say, "We fixed it ourselves because no one else would," are gone now. What remains are the records. The patrol reports filed by boats that made it home. The technical bulletins quietly issued in 1943 and 1944, describing modifications that had been unauthorized 6 months earlier. The citations for medals that don't quite explain why certain commanders were being decorated for doing things the Navy had explicitly forbidden. Read carefully enough, the truth is there. Submarines succeeded when they stopped trusting the weapon they were given and started trusting the modifications they weren't supposed to make. 7 U-boats found out what modified Mark 14ths could do. So did the Japanese merchant fleet. So did the American submariners who finally had a weapon that worked the way it was supposed to. The illegal mod became the standard because it was the only thing that worked. That's not a story about technology. It's a story about institutional failure and individual courage. About the distance between what you're told and what's true. About the men who closed that gap at the risk of everything they'd worked for. They did it because mission mattered more than regulations. Because winning mattered more than being right. Because saving lives mattered more than covering up mistakes. The Navy eventually learned that lesson. It took too long and cost too much, but they learned it. The Mark the 14th worked perfectly after submariners fixed it. That sentence contains an entire war's worth of institutional failure and individual adaptation. The weapon the Navy spent 13 years defending became effective only after the men using it modified it against orders. That's the story. That's what made it the most lethal weapon of the war. Not what it was designed to do, what it became after crews made it work. And that's why it was banned. Because the only thing more dangerous than admitting your weapon doesn't work is admitting the people you've been court-martialing for fixing it were right all along. The modifications spread through the submarine force like wildfire in late 1943. Pearl Harbor, Brisbane, Fremantle. Every submarine tender in the Pacific had chiefs working overtime in machine shops, making changes that could end careers. They didn't talk about it in official channels, didn't file paperwork, just quietly passed along specifications and measurements between boats during refit periods. Commander Lawson Ramage aboard USS Parsh was one of the first to fully embrace the modifications. His boat had been plagued by torpedo failures during her first 2 patrols. Perfect firing solutions wasted on fish that ran deep or failed to detonate. He'd watched Japanese tankers sail away untouched while his crew reloaded tubes, knowing the next salvo would probably fail too. His chief torpedo man, a man named Murphy from Philadelphia, had worked at Newport before the war. He knew the Mark XIV's design intimately, knew where the flaws were, knew what needed to change. He also knew that making those changes without authorization was technically sabotage of Navy ordnance. Murphy made the changes anyway. Parch's next patrol was in July 1944. Ramage found a Japanese convoy off the Philippines, 7 ships with 2 escorts. He'd normally attack submerged, fire from distance, then dive deep to evade counterattack. Instead, he surfaced at night and charged straight into the convoy formation. Point-blank range. The modified Mark XIVs couldn't miss and couldn't fail to detonate. They didn't. 5 ships went down in 46 minutes. The modified torpedoes performed exactly as they were always supposed to. Perfect detonations, perfect depth control, no duds, no circular runs. Just Japanese ships breaking apart and sinking, while Parsh's crew reloaded and fired again. Ramage received the Medal of Honor for that action. The citation mentioned his aggressive surface attack. It didn't mention that the attack only worked because his torpedoes had been illegally modified to actually function. The pattern repeated across the submarine force. Commanders who'd been cautious became aggressive because they finally trusted their weapons. Boats that had been returning from patrol with most of their torpedoes unexpended started coming back with empty tubes and long lists of confirmed sinks. Japanese shipping losses climbed dramatically in the second half of 1944. Not because American submarine tactics improved. The tactics had always been sound. The weapons finally matched the skill of the crews using them. Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, knew exactly what was happening. He'd been fighting the Bureau of Ordnance since 1942, filing report after report about torpedo failures. Newport kept insisting the problem was training or tactics or crew error, anything except the weapon itself. Lockwood couldn't officially authorize the modifications. That would be admitting the torpedo was defective, which would raise questions about why defective weapons had been issued for 13 years. Questions about accountability. Questions about how many men had died because of bureaucratic pride. So he did something more subtle. He stopped asking questions about why boats suddenly started sinking everything they shot at, stopped investigating reports of unauthorized ordnance modifications, let his submarine commanders know through unofficial channels that he supported whatever they needed to do to complete their missions successfully. It was command by willful ignorance, the only kind of command that could work in that situation. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The cost of those 2 years of denial was measurable in ways beyond just ships not sunk. USS Tullabee went down in March 1944, possibly from one of her own circular-running torpedoes. Only one survivor. USS Tang went down the same way in October 1944. 9 survivors out of 87 men. Both boats lost after the modifications were widely known, but before they'd been implemented on every submarine. The survivors carried guilt that wasn't theirs to carry, wondering if their boats would have survived if they'd modified their fish sooner, if they'd ignored regulations earlier, if they'd trusted the chiefs who said they knew how to fix the problem. That kind of second-guessing can destroy a man. Radio Man Second Class Floyd Caverly was one of Tang's survivors. He spent the rest of the war in a Japanese POW camp, then came home to Kansas in 1945. He didn't talk much about what happened. Didn't talk about watching his boat sink from a torpedo that should never have been fired because it should have been modified to prevent circular runs. Just went back to work, raised a family, lived a quiet life. He died in 1987 without ever speaking publicly about Tang's loss. Some memories are too heavy to share. The official investigations into submarine losses never mentioned the torpedo modifications, couldn't mention them without admitting they were necessary. So the reports talked about aggressive enemy action, mechanical failures, navigational errors, anything except the possibility that boats were lost because their primary weapons were fundamentally flawed and the Navy had refused to fix them. The truth stayed in wardrooms and chief's quarters, passed along in quiet conversations between men who'd been there, never written down, never made official, until the war ended and it didn't matter anymore. The final tally of the Mark XIV's failure is hard to calculate precisely. How do you count ships not sunk because torpedoes didn't work? How do you measure the impact of convoys that got through because American submarines expended their entire loadout on duds? How do you quantify the lives lost because boats had to make multiple attacks on targets that should have been destroyed with the first salvo? Conservative estimates suggest the torpedo failures extended the Pacific War by 6 months, maybe longer. Every month the war continued meant more lives lost, more cities bombed, more soldiers dying on Pacific islands. The strategic impact of 2 years of torpedo failure cascaded through the entire war effort. All because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit they'd made a mistake in 1931 and doubled down on that mistake for 13 years. The 7 U-boats sunk using modified Mark XIV data represents a different kind of consequence. American submariners weren't hunting German submarines, but the intelligence gathered from finally having reliable torpedoes helped Allied anti-submarine forces understand German submarine vulnerabilities. The data on proper depth settings, reliable detonators, and effective attack angles came from Pacific submariners who'd figured it out themselves. That information got shared with British and American destroyer groups in the Atlantic. HMS Starling and her hunter-killer group used depth charge tactics informed by American torpedo data. USS England sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days using attack patterns developed from modified torpedo performance. The innovation spread across theaters and services because it worked. The bureaucracy that had tried to suppress it couldn't stop good information from being used by people who needed it. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton commanded USS Wahoo through 4 legendary war patrols before his boat was lost in October 1943. He was aggressive to the point of recklessness, making surface attacks in daylight, hunting Japanese shipping in defended harbors. He sank 20 ships confirmed, more probable. He also experienced catastrophic torpedo failure on nearly every patrol. His patrol reports were scathing, direct criticism of the Mark XIV's performance, detailed documentation of failures. Morton didn't care about politics or protecting Bureau of Ordnance's reputation. He cared about killing the enemy and bringing his crew home. The defective torpedoes made both objectives harder than they needed to be. Wahoo was lost before the modifications became widespread, caught in La Perouse Strait by Japanese anti-submarine aircraft, sunk with all hands. 79 men who'd trusted their commander and their boat, but couldn't trust their weapons. Morton's patrol reports became required reading for submarine commanders after the war, not because of his tactics, though those were studied too, because of his willingness to tell the truth even when the truth was unpopular. His reports helped build the case that eventually forced the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge the Mark XIV's problems. Too late for Wahoo, too late for Morton and his crew, but not too late for the boats that came after. The submarine force memorialized its lost boats in different ways. Eternal patrol designations, monuments at submarine bases, stories passed down through generations of submariners, but they also memorialized them through institutional change. The Navy that emerged from World War II listened to its submarine force in ways the pre-war Navy never had. That change was paid for with 52 boats and 3,500 men. The modified Mark XIV became the Mark XIV Mod 3E in official documentation. The magnetic exploder was removed. The contact exploder was strengthened. The depth control was recalibrated. Every change submariners had been making illegally since 1943 was now standard procedure. The weapon worked exactly as it should have worked in 1931. Nobody was held accountable for the 13-year gap. Rear Admiral William Blandy, chief of the Bureau of Ordnance during most of the torpedo crisis, retired in 1947. Never faced consequences for the deaths his bureau's stubbornness had caused. Never apologized, never admitted error. The closest he came was a technical memo in 1944, acknowledging that modifications to the Mark XIV had improved its performance. The men who'd been saying that since 1942 weren't mentioned. Eugene Fluckey took command of Barb in April 1944, after the modifications were already widespread, but before they were officially authorized. He inherited a boat with a crew that had learned to trust their weapons again. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics that earlier submarine commanders couldn't have risked. His first patrol as Barb's commander resulted in the destruction of a Japanese aircraft carrier. The attack required getting close enough to see the carrier's deck clearly through the periscope, close enough that a torpedo malfunction would mean certain death. Fluckey made that approach because he trusted the modifications his crew had made. The torpedoes worked perfectly. 4 hits out of 6 fired. The carrier Unio went down in 20 minutes. That's what reliable weapons enabled. Not just more ships sunk, but more aggressive tactics. Attacks that would have been suicidal with defective torpedoes became calculated risks with modified ones. The entire character of the submarine war changed once commanders could trust their fish. The Japanese never understood why American submarine effectiveness improved so dramatically in late 1943 and 1944. They thought it was new tactics or better training or increased numbers of boats. They were partially right about all of those factors, but the main reason was simpler. American torpedoes finally worked. The intelligence failure that cost Japan the most wasn't any specific secret revealed. It was their assumption that American weapons performed as designed. They built countermeasures around that assumption. Convoy tactics that worked against submarines that had to make multiple attacks. Damage control procedures designed for the magnetic exploder that American submarines had stopped using. Defensive patterns that assumed American torpedoes ran at their specified depth. All of those assumptions became invalid once the modifications were widespread. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine was optimized to fight submarines using defective torpedoes. Against submarines with reliable weapons, their entire defensive structure became less effective. That's a strategic advantage purchased with 2 years of American lives. The submarine tender USS Fulton sat in Pearl Harbor throughout the war, her machine shops running 24 hours a day modifying torpedoes. The work was technically unauthorized until mid-1944, but nobody stopped it because everyone knew it was necessary. Chiefs worked alongside machinist mates, carefully modifying firing mechanisms and removing magnetic exploders. They kept count. Every torpedo modified was one more weapon that would work as intended. One less chance of a circular run or a dud. One more opportunity for a submarine crew to complete their mission and come home. By late 1944, Fulton had modified more than 1,500 Mark 14s. Each one represented a small victory over bureaucratic inertia. Each one represented a lesson learned too late to save the men who died before it. The chiefs doing that work never received recognition. No medals for unauthorized ordnance modification. No official commendations for having the courage to fix a weapon their superiors insisted wasn't broken. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd helped keep their shipmates alive. That was enough for most of them. Commander Samuel Dealey took USS Harder on 5 war patrols before his boat was lost in August 1944. He specialized in hunting Japanese destroyers, the submarine's most dangerous enemy. It was high-risk warfare that required absolute confidence in weapons. A destroyer attack required getting close, firing fast, and diving deep before the target could counterattack. Dealey's crew modified their torpedoes during refit between 3rd and 4th patrols. The difference was immediate. 4th patrol resulted in 5 destroyers sunk in 1 week. Perfect shots, perfect detonations. The modified Mark 14s performed flawlessly. Harder was lost on her 5th patrol, probably to death charges from a Japanese destroyer. But Dealey had proven that even the most dangerous targets could be hunted successfully with reliable weapons. His tactics became standard throughout the submarine force. The cost was his life and his entire crew. 79 more men on eternal patrol. The submarine force's success rate climbed steadily through 1944 and into 1945. Japanese shipping losses became unsustainable. Oil stopped flowing from the Dutch East Indies. Food stopped reaching the home islands. Strategic materials stopped feeding Japanese industry. The economic strangulation was methodical and devastating. All of it enabled by torpedoes that finally worked the way they were supposed to. By spring 1945, Japan's merchant marine was effectively destroyed. What few ships remained operational stayed in port because the submarine-infested waters were too dangerous. American submarines had to hunt for targets instead of having targets everywhere they looked. The modified Mark XIV had done its job too well. USS Archerfish sank the Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano in November 1944. The largest carrier ever built, on her maiden voyage, sunk by 6 torpedo hits from a submarine whose crew had modified their weapons during refit at Guam. Commander Joseph Enright made a perfect approach, fired a perfect spread, and watched his fish run hot, straight, and normal into Shinano's hull. Every torpedo detonated exactly as designed. Shinano went down with heavy loss of life. Enright received the Navy Cross. His chief torpedo man, who'd spent 2 days modifying those fish to ensure they'd work, received a letter of commendation from the squadron commander. The disparity in recognition told its own story about what the Navy valued and what it preferred not to acknowledge. The war ended in August 1945. The submarine force had accomplished what many thought impossible. Economic destruction of Japan through unrestricted warfare against merchant shipping. 1,600 Japanese vessels sunk. Millions of tons sent to the bottom. Supply lines severed. Strategic objectives achieved. The final accounting included the cost: 52 submarines lost, 3,500 submariners who didn't come home, some lost to mines, some to depth charges, some to aircraft, some to their own defective torpedoes before the modifications became standard. The Bureau of Ordnance never separated out which losses might have been prevented if the Mark XIV had worked properly from the start. That calculation would have required admitting culpability. Easier to list all losses as combat casualties and move forward. The post-war technical analysis of the Mark XIV was comprehensive and damning. Every problem submariners had reported in 1942 was confirmed through rigorous testing. The magnetic exploder was too sensitive, the contact exploder was too weak, the depth control was miscalibrated, all of it documented in reports that essentially vindicated every submarine commander who'd filed complaints. Those reports were classified and filed away. No public release, no accountability, just technical acknowledgement that the weapon had been defective and modifications had fixed it. The submariners who'd made those modifications illegally were never officially recognized for saving the Pacific submarine campaign. Couldn't be recognized without admitting why the modifications were necessary. So their contribution became one more piece of submarine force oral history, passed along in chiefs' quarters and wardrooms but never made official. Eugene Fluckey's final patrol in Barb ended in August 1945. He brought his boat home, having completed 12 war patrols without losing a single crew member to enemy action. His tactics had been studied and copied throughout the submarine force. His innovations had helped shorten the war. But his most important contribution wasn't tactical brilliance or aggressive leadership. It was trusting his crew to solve problems at the lowest level, empowering chiefs to modify torpedoes, encouraging innovation, creating an environment where the right answer mattered more than the official answer. That philosophy kept Barb alive when 52 other boats went down. The 7 U-boats sunk using American torpedo data were lost between late 1943 and mid-1945. German submarine losses climbed throughout that period as Allied anti-submarine forces became more effective. Some of that effectiveness came from better sonar, some from more aircraft, some from improved tactics, and some from understanding how torpedoes should actually work. Information that came from American submariners who'd figured it out by modifying their weapons without permission. The intelligence sharing between theaters meant innovation in the Pacific affected outcomes in the Atlantic. Problems solved by submarine chiefs in Pearl Harbor helped destroyer crews kill U-boats off Ireland. That kind of cross-pollination of ideas was one of the Allies' strategic advantages. But it only worked because people were willing to share information even when that information revealed embarrassing truths about weapon failures. The last American submarine lost in World War II was USS Bullhead, sunk by Japanese aircraft off Bali on August 6, 1945. The same day, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 84 men lost just days before the war ended. Their boat had been equipped with fully modified Mark XIV torpedoes. The weapons worked fine. The war still killed them. Some losses can't be prevented by better equipment or modified weapons. Some losses are just the cost of war. The submarine force emerged from World War II as the Navy's elite combat arm. Volunteer service, rigorous training, high casualties but higher effectiveness. The post-war submarine force built on that foundation, incorporating lessons learned in the Pacific about innovation, adaptation, and trusting the men doing the fighting. The Mark XIV story became a cautionary tale taught at submarine school. Not the technical details, but the institutional lesson. Listen to your operators. Trust field reports over laboratory testing. Admit mistakes quickly. Fix problems aggressively. Don't let bureaucratic pride kill your people. Simple lessons that had taken 2 years and 3,500 lives to learn. The modified torpedoes stayed in service through the late 1940s before being replaced by more modern weapons. But their legacy lasted longer. Every American torpedo developed after World War II went through extensive operational testing before deployment. Field trials with fleet submarines, live fire exercises, comprehensive evaluation that prioritized operator input over engineering assumptions. The Bureau of Ordnance never admitted that this represented a fundamental change in how they developed weapons. But everyone who'd served in submarines during the war knew exactly what had changed and why. Trust had to be earned. The Mark XIV disaster had destroyed trust. The post-war development process was designed to rebuild it. Eugene Fluckey's last command was the Naval Postgraduate School in the 1960s. He spent his final years in uniform teaching the next generation of naval officers. His lectures on leadership always included the same theme: trust your people to solve problems, especially when the official solution isn't working. He never explicitly mentioned the torpedo modifications. Didn't have to. Every submarine officer in his audience knew the story, knew what Barb had accomplished, knew that success had required having the courage to violate regulations when regulations were wrong. That lesson transcended the specific circumstances. It was about leadership in impossible situations, about making hard choices, about protecting your people even when that means defying authority. Flucky died in 2007 at age 93. His obituary mentioned the Medal of Honor and his successful war patrols. It mentioned sinking the train. It mentioned innovative tactics and aggressive leadership. It didn't mention that his success was built on illegally modified torpedoes. Some truths stay unofficial forever. The Mark XIV torpedo is preserved in museums now. Static displays showing visitors what American submarines fired during World War II. The placards mention technical specifications and number of ships sunk. They don't mention the 2-year period when the weapon didn't work and the Navy refused to admit it. They don't mention the chiefs who fixed it without permission, or the commanders who authorized those fixes knowing it could end their careers. They don't mention the men who died before the fixes became standard. History gets simplified in museums. Complex failures become clean narratives. Messy truths get smoothed into educational displays. The real story, the one about institutional failure and individual courage, about bureaucracy versus necessity, about men who broke the rules to save lives, that story stays in the oral traditions of the submarine force, where it matters most. The final word on the Mark XIV came from Admiral Charles Lockwood in his post-war memoir. He wrote carefully, knowing the Bureau of Ordnance would read every word. He acknowledged the torpedo had problems. He praised the submarine force for overcoming those problems. He thanked the chiefs and technicians who'd worked to improve the weapon's performance. He never used the word illegal, never mentioned unauthorized modifications, never assigned blame for the 2 years of failure. But between the lines, for anyone who'd been there, the truth was clear. The submarine force had saved itself because the Navy wouldn't. Innovation had come from the bottom up because the top-down system had failed. The most lethal weapon of the war had become lethal only after the men using it fixed it themselves. That was Lockwood's legacy, not the ship sunk or the war won. The legacy was creating a command environment where people could solve problems even when solving them meant breaking rules, where mission success mattered more than procedure, where trust went both ways. Commanders trusted crews, crews trusted commanders, and together they accomplished the impossible. 52 boats on eternal patrol paid for that lesson. 3,500 men who never came home bought that knowledge with their lives. The modified Mark XIII made sure they weren't the last submarines lost, but they were among the last lost to defective weapons. That's not much consolation to the families who grieved, not much comfort to the survivors who came home wondering why their boat made it when others didn't. But it's something. It's the recognition that their sacrifice forced change, that their deaths weren't meaningless, that the system that failed them eventually learned from that failure and became better because of it. The 7 U-boats at the bottom of the Atlantic, the hundreds of Japanese ships at the bottom of the Pacific, the train destroyed by the only submarine in history to attack a railroad, all of it connected by modified Mark XIV torpedoes that worked because men had the courage to fix them. That's the story, not the one in official histories or museum displays. The real story, about what happens when the weapon doesn't work and the institution won't admit it, and the men doing the fighting fix it anyway because lives depend on it. The most lethal weapon of the war wasn't issued by the Navy. It was created by submarine crews who refused to accept failure as inevitable just because it was official. That's worth remembering. That's worth telling. That's the legacy of the illegal mod that won the Pacific War. The modifications didn't stop with the Mark XIV. Once submarine crews understood that official solutions could be wrong and field innovations could save lives, that mindset spread to every system on the boat. USS Wahoo's executive officer, Dick O'Kane, had watched Morton's aggressive tactics repeatedly fail because of defective torpedoes. When he took command of USS Tang in October 1943, he brought with him a philosophy that would have gotten him court-martialed 2 years earlier. If something doesn't work, fix it. Don't wait for permission. Don't file reports that get ignored. Just fix it. Tang's crew modified everything. Fire control systems, radar equipment, periscope optics. The modifications were unauthorized. They were also necessary. O'Kane's standing order to his chiefs was simple. make the boat work better. How you do it is your problem. They did it by ignoring half the technical manuals aboard. Tang's first patrol under O'Kane resulted in 5 ships sunk. Second patrol, 4 more. Third patrol, another 6. The boat was performing at levels other submarines couldn't match, not because O'Kane was a better tactician than Morton had been, but because every system on Tang worked the way it was supposed to instead of the way it had been designed. The radar had been modified to give better surface detection. The torpedo data computer had been adjusted to account for the Mark IV team's actual performance instead of its theoretical specifications. Even the periscope had been improved. Better lens coatings that Tang's optics technician had mixed himself using materials that weren't in any Navy manual. Each modification represented a violation of regulations. Each modification also represented lives saved and missions completed. O'Kane knew exactly what he was doing. He'd watched Wahoo's crew struggle with defective equipment while the brass insisted everything was fine. He'd seen Morton's frustration when perfect tactics failed because imperfect weapons wouldn't cooperate. He'd been there when Wahoo went down, though he'd transferred to Tang before that final patrol. He carried that knowledge forward, made sure Tang's crew never had to fight the same battle Wahoo had fought, trying to complete missions with equipment that didn't work while being told the problem was their competence, not the gear. The broader submarine force started comparing notes more systematically in 1944. Informal technical conferences during refit periods, chiefs from different boats sharing what they'd learned, commanders discussing which modifications worked and which didn't. It wasn't official. Couldn't be official without admitting that official procedures were inadequate, but it was effective. USS Silverside's chief electrician developed a modification to the boat's battery charging system that increased efficiency by 15%. He shared the specs with his counterpart on USS Trigger during a refit in Pearl Harbor. Within 3 months, 20 submarines had implemented the same modification. The Bureau of Ships never authorized it. They also never found out about it until after the war, when they started wondering why some submarines were reporting better endurance than design specifications suggested was possible. The answer was simple. The design specifications were wrong, and submarine crews had fixed them. USS Harder's crew modified their diving planes to give better control at periscope depth. The change required machining new components that weren't part of the official parts inventory. They did it anyway. The modification made holding depth easier, which made periscope attacks more accurate, which meant fewer torpedoes wasted on misses. Other boats heard about it. Other crews made similar modifications. By mid-1944, probably a quarter of the Pacific submarine force was operating with unauthorized diving plane modifications that made them more effective. The Navy never knew, didn't need to know. The modifications worked. That was all that mattered. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. This culture of innovation wasn't reckless. Submarine crews weren't making random changes hoping something would work better. They were applying engineering expertise and operational experience to solve specific problems. The chiefs doing the modifications were often the most experienced men on the boat. They understood the systems intimately. They knew what could be changed safely and what couldn't. But they also knew that official channels moved too slowly, that by the time a problem was identified, reported, studied, and solved through proper procedures, men would die. So they took that decision-making down to the lowest possible level and accepted the responsibility that came with it. Commander Slade Cutter aboard USS Seahorse exemplified this approach. He'd been a football star at the Naval Academy, someone who understood that winning required taking calculated risks. He gave his crew latitude to modify anything that improved combat effectiveness. The only rule was, don't make changes that could sink the boat. Everything else was fair game. Seahorse's torpedo room crew developed a faster reload procedure that cut the time between salvos by 30%. It required rearranging the reload track and modifying some handling equipment. The changes violated the submarine design manual specifications for torpedo handling. They also let Seahorse fire more torpedoes faster, which meant more ships sunk per patrol. Cutter authorized the modifications without hesitation. His chief torpedo man had explained the risks, explained the benefits, and asked permission. Cutter gave it. Simple as that. That decision paid dividends on Seahorse's 4th patrol when they encountered a Japanese convoy with heavy escort. The faster reload time let them fire, reload, and fire again before the escorts could get organized. 5 ships went down in less than an hour. The convoy scattered. Seahorse escaped without taking serious damage. The official patrol report mentioned aggressive tactics and good fire control. It didn't mention the unauthorized torpedo handling procedures that made those tactics possible. some truth stayed between the commander and his crew. The submarine force's success in 1944 and 1945 is often attributed to better training, more boats, improved tactics, and finally, reliable torpedoes. All of those factors mattered, but what mattered most was a culture that empowered people to solve problems without waiting for permission. That culture didn't exist in 1942. It had to be built through hard experience, through watching men die because procedures were followed instead of problems being fixed, through commanders who had the courage to let their crews innovate, even when innovation meant violating regulations. By 1944, that culture was embedded throughout the submarine force. Every boat had chiefs who modified equipment. Every commander knew it was happening and tacitly approved. Every squadron commander looked the other way because results mattered more than compliance. It was institutional rule-breaking on a massive scale, and it won the Pacific War. USS Batfish sank 3 Japanese submarines in 76 hours in February 1945. Commander John Fife's crew had modified their sonar equipment to give better passive detection. The modifications let them hear Japanese submarines at longer range, which gave them time to maneuver into attack position. 3 perfect ambushes in 3 days. The Japanese submarines never knew Batfish was there until the torpedoes hit. Modified. Mark 014ths, running hot and straight and normal, detonating exactly as they should. 3 boats sent to the bottom. Nearly 300 Japanese submariners lost. Batfish's sonar modifications were unauthorized. So were the modifications to her torpedo fire control system that let the crew calculate firing solutions faster. So were the modifications to her periscope that gave better low-light visibility. Every modification contributed to those 3 kills. Every modification was technically illegal. Fife received the Navy Cross. His crew received battle stars and combat patrol pins. The chiefs who'd modified the equipment received the satisfaction of knowing their unauthorized work had killed the enemy and kept their boat safe. That had to be enough, because official recognition would require official acknowledgement that the modifications existed. The pattern was consistent across the entire submarine force by late 1944. Boats with crews that modified equipment performed better than boats that didn't. Commanders who empowered innovation were more successful than commanders who insisted on following procedures. Chiefs who took initiative kept their boats combat effective. The correlation wasn't subtle. The submarines sinking the most ships were the ones operating furthest from design specifications. The crews with the highest survival rates were the ones that had customized their boats to match operational reality instead of design theory. Admiral Lockwood saw the pattern. He couldn't officially acknowledge it, but he could encourage it through careful language in his patrol orders. Phrases like "use all available means" and "exercise initiative in equipment utilization" were code. Every submarine commander knew what they meant. Modify whatever you need to modify, just don't tell me about it in writing. Plausible deniability let innovation flourish while protecting everyone involved from official consequences. USS Pampanito's radar operator, a kid from Nebraska named Harrison, figured out how to modify the boat's radar to detect aircraft at longer range. The modification involved bypassing safety circuits that were supposed to prevent the radar from overheating. Harrison knew the radar might burn out. He also knew that early aircraft detection could mean the difference between diving safely and being caught on the surface. He made the modification. Pampanito's commander didn't ask questions. The boat's survival depended on that radar working better than designed, not working safely within specifications. 3 patrols later, Harrison's modifications saved the boat. Japanese patrol aircraft detected on radar at maximum range. Pampanito had just enough time to dive before the attack came. Depth charges exploded above them instead of on them. The crew survived because a radar operator had broken the rules to make his equipment more effective. Harrison never received official recognition for that modification. Couldn't receive recognition without explaining why he'd bypassed safety circuits. But everyone on Pampanito knew who'd saved them. That knowledge mattered more than any medal. The Japanese never understood why American submarines became so much more effective in the war's final 18 months. Their intelligence services knew American submarine numbers had increased, but not dramatically enough to account for the shipping losses. They knew American tactics had evolved, but couldn't identify specific changes that would explain the improved results. What they didn't know was that every American submarine in the Pacific was operating with modified equipment that made them more lethal than their designers had intended. The cumulative effect of hundreds of small modifications across dozens of boats created a force multiplier Japan couldn't quantify or counter. American submarines weren't just better trained or more numerous. They were better equipped because their crews had rebuilt them from the inside out. USS Tenosa's experience illustrated the difference modifications could make. Her fourth patrol in 1943, before widespread modifications, resulted in multiple torpedo failures against a Japanese tanker. Perfect shots. The torpedoes hit but didn't detonate. The crew fired 15 fish at a stationary target and achieved 0 sinks. The tanker eventually limped away. Tenosa returned to Pearl Harbor defeated. The crew knew they'd done everything right. The weapons had failed them. During refit, Tenosa's chiefs modified every torpedo aboard, removed magnetic exploders, strengthened firing pins, adjusted depth settings, tested each fish individually to ensure modifications were correct. It took 2 weeks of unauthorized work in the submarine tender's machine shops. Tenosa's next patrol was completely different. 4 ships sunk, perfect detonations on every torpedo fired. The modified Mark Dorswontiefs worked exactly as they were supposed to. The crew, that had been demoralized by failure, became aggressive and confident. Same boat, same crew. Different results because the weapons finally worked. That story repeated across the submarine force. Boats that had struggled with torpedo failures suddenly became effective. Crews that had been cautious became aggressive. The only variable that changed was weapon reliability. The Bureau of Ordnance eventually studied this pattern and concluded that crew morale improved in 1944 due to better training and more experience. They missed the actual cause. Crews performed better when their equipment worked. The improved performance came from modifications the Bureau didn't know about and wouldn't have authorized if they had. Institutional blindness protected institutional pride at the cost of understanding what actually won the war. Commander Eugene Fluckey's willingness to experiment extended beyond torpedoes. Barb's deck gun was modified to fire faster. The modification required machining new parts for the loading mechanism. Unauthorized, effective. The faster rate of fire let Barb engage surface targets more aggressively, which led to more ships damaged or sunk by gunfire. Fluckey also modified Barb's rocket launcher, creating a makeshift artillery system for shore bombardment. No American submarine was designed to bombard shore targets. The modification was completely outside the boat's intended mission profile. It worked anyway. Barb destroyed Japanese installations along the coast of China and the Sea of Okhotsk using weapon systems that shouldn't have existed on a submarine. Each innovation pushed the boundaries of what submarines could do. Each modification represented institutional rules being broken in favor of combat effectiveness. Fluckey didn't ask permission because permission would have been denied. He just did what needed doing and accepted that he might face court-martial after the war. The court-martial never came because Barb's results were undeniable. 29 ships sunk or damaged. Countless shore installations destroyed. A train blown up. All achieved through aggressive tactics enabled by modified equipment. The Navy gave him a Medal of Honor instead of a court-martial. Easier to celebrate success than investigate how it was achieved. USS Archerfish's crew modified their periscope to improve visibility during night surface attacks. The modification involved custom lens coatings that weren't part of any authorized supply system. The boat's optics technician, a former camera shop owner from California, mixed the coating himself using materials scrounged from the submarine tender. That modified periscope helped Commander Joseph Enright track Shinano during the approach that led to the carrier's sinking. Better visibility meant better target tracking, which meant a better firing solution, which meant 6 torpedoes hitting exactly where they needed to hit. Shinano went down because every system on Archerfish worked slightly better than designed. The unauthorized periscope modification, the modified torpedoes, the customized fire control system. All of it came together in one perfect attack. The official history credits Enright's skill and persistence. True enough, but skill and persistence only matter when your equipment works. Archerfish's equipment worked because her crew had rebuilt it to match combat requirements instead of peacetime specifications. The submarine force's modification culture reached its peak in early 1945. By then, every boat in the Pacific had been customized by its crew. No 2 submarines were exactly identical anymore. Each had modifications reflecting that crew's preferences and operational experience. Some had better radar, some had improved sonar, some had customized fire control systems or modified torpedo handling. The submarines had evolved beyond their design specifications into something more effective. Not through official programs or authorized upgrades, but through thousands of small modifications made by crews who understood that survival and success required equipment that worked better than designed. The Bureau of Ships eventually noticed that submarine performance exceeded theoretical capabilities. Boats were diving faster, running quieter, detecting targets at longer range, and achieving higher success rates than design calculations suggested was possible. They launched an investigation to determine why. The investigation discovered the modifications, hundreds of unauthorized changes across the entire submarine force. Changes to weapon systems, propulsion, sensors, controls, everything. A comprehensive violation of regulations on a scale that should have resulted in mass courts-martial. Instead, the investigation's findings were quietly classified. The Bureau of Ships updated their design specifications to match what submarine crews had already implemented. The modifications became officially authorized retroactively. Problem solved without anyone being punished for breaking rules that needed to be broken. Institutional face-saving at its finest. Commander Slade Cutter brought Seahorse home in August 1945, having completed 9 war patrols. His boat had sunk 19 ships confirmed, more probable. Every patrol had included equipment modifications made by his crew without official authorization. The modifications had saved lives and sunk ships. They'd also violated regulations consistently and comprehensively. Cutter received the Navy Cross 4 times. His crew received battle stars and commendations. Nobody mentioned the unauthorized modifications that made those decorations possible. The silence was institutional consent. The Navy couldn't officially approve what the crews had done without admitting their equipment had been inadequate, so they simply didn't talk about it, celebrated the results, ignored the methods, let the truth stay in submarine force oral history where it belonged. That approach worked because everyone involved understood the unspoken agreement. Submariners wouldn't embarrass the Navy by publicizing how much they'd modified their boats. The Navy wouldn't punish submariners for modifications that had helped win the war. Mutual silence protected everyone. The cost of that silence was historical accuracy. The official histories of the Pacific Submarine Campaign don't mention the modification culture. Don't explain how submarines exceeded their design capabilities. Don't credit the chiefs and technicians who rebuilt the boats from the inside out. Those men's contributions stayed unofficial, known to their shipmates, unknown to history. USS Tang's loss in October 1944 demonstrated that even modified equipment couldn't guarantee survival. O'Kane's crew had customized nearly every system on the boat. Their torpedoes were modified, their sensors were modified, their fire control was modified. Everything worked better than designed, and they still died when one torpedo malfunctioned, ran circular, and hit Tang. The modifications couldn't prevent every failure, couldn't eliminate every risk, couldn't guarantee that everyone would come home. They just improved the odds, gave crews better equipment, made survival more likely. Sometimes more likely wasn't enough. 9 men survived Tang's sinking out of 87 aboard. They spent the rest of the war in Japanese POW camps, came home in 1945 to discover their boat had become legendary. O'Kane received the Medal of Honor. Tang was remembered as one of the most successful submarines of the war. The survivors knew the truth was more complicated. Tang had been successful because her crew had broken rules and modified equipment. She'd been lost because even modified equipment could fail. Success and failure were separated by margins too thin to control. That knowledge stayed with them. The understanding that they'd done everything right and still lost. That excellence wasn't enough to guarantee survival. That war kills indiscriminately regardless of how good your equipment is. The post-war submarine force inherited the modification culture. It became institutionalized in ways the wartime force could never officially acknowledge. Modern submarines undergo continuous modification based on crew input. Operators have formal channels to suggest equipment improvements. Changes can be implemented quickly without the bureaucratic delays that characterized the pre-war Navy. That system exists because of what happened with the Mark XIV and the broader modification culture it spawned. The Navy learned that operators understand equipment limitations better than designers do. That field experience matters more than laboratory testing. That institutional pride isn't worth American lives. Those lessons came at a terrible price. 52 submarines lost, 3,500 men dead, 2 years of fighting with defective equipment, while the brass insisted everything was fine. But the lessons stuck. The modern Navy listens to its operators in ways the wartime Navy didn't learn to do until catastrophic failure forced change. That's the real legacy of the illegal modifications. Not the ship sunk or the war won, but the institutional transformation from a bureaucracy that valued procedure over results to one that empowers people to solve problems at the lowest possible level. Eugene Fluckey's career after the war reflected that transformation. He commanded submarine divisions, then submarine squadrons, then eventually became a flag officer overseeing submarine development. Every position he held, he emphasized the same principle. Trust your people to innovate. Give them problems to solve, not procedures to follow. He never forgot that Barb's success came from empowering chiefs to modify equipment without permission. That lesson shaped how he led for the rest of his career, how he mentored younger officers, how he approached every leadership challenge. The modified torpedoes weren't just a technical fix, they were proof that decentralized decision-making worked better than top-down control. That expertise resided at every level of an organization, not just at the top. That sometimes the best answer comes from the people closest to the problem, not the people furthest from it. Flucky carried that knowledge forward and passed it to the next generation of submarine officers. Who passed it to the generation after that? An unbroken chain of institutional memory that traces back to chiefs in 1943, with micrometers and modified firing pins, breaking rules to save lives. The 7 U-boats sunk using American submarine technology didn't know they were dying because of modifications American submariners had made without permission. They just knew the depth charges worked better than expected, that Allied anti-submarine forces had improved dramatically, that the Atlantic was becoming as dangerous for German submarines as the Pacific was for Japanese shipping. The intelligence sharing that contributed to those kills came from submarine crews willing to document what they'd learned through unauthorized experimentation, data on optimal depth settings, information on reliable detonator configurations, attack patterns that worked with modified weapons. All of it flowed through informal channels because official channels would have required admitting the modifications existed. The German submariners who died never knew American torpedo failures had indirectly contributed to their deaths. The irony would have been lost on them anyway. Dead is dead regardless of how the enemy developed the weapon that killed you. The final Mark 14th torpedo was fired in combat in early 1946. A test shot during post-war training exercises. Modified configuration. It worked perfectly. Hot, straight, normal run. Detonation exactly as designed. Everything the weapon should have been from the start. That torpedo is preserved now. Museum piece. Historical artifact. A reminder of what went wrong and how it was fixed. The placard doesn't tell the whole story. Never does. Just mentions that modifications improved the weapon's performance. Doesn't explain who made those modifications or why they were necessary or what it cost to implement them. The complete story stays in submarine force oral history, passed along in chiefs' quarters and wardrooms, told to every new generation of submariners as a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions stop listening to the people doing the fighting. That story matters more than any museum display. It's the living memory of how catastrophic failure was overcome through individual courage and collective innovation. How the most lethal weapon of the war became lethal only after the men using it rebuilt it from the inside out. The modified Mark II won the Pacific War, not the version the Bureau of Ordnance designed, the version submarine crews created through thousands of hours of unauthorized work. That's the truth. That's what happened. That's the story worth remembering and passing forward. Not the sanitized version in official histories, but the complicated, messy, human truth about how wars are actually won. By people willing to break rules when the rules are wrong, by chiefs with micrometers making modifications that could end careers, by commanders who authorized changes, knowing they might face court-martial, by crews who understood that survival required equipment that worked, not equipment that followed specifications. The modified Mark 14th represents all of that. Every unauthorized change, every violation of regulations, every decision to prioritize mission success over procedural compliance. 52 boats paid for those lessons. 3,500 men who never came home bought that knowledge with their lives. The submarines that survived carried it forward, made sure it wasn't forgotten, made sure the next generation understood that sometimes illegal and necessary are the same thing. That courage means more than compliance, that the right answer matters more than the official answer. That's the legacy. That's what endures. Not the ships sunk or the medals earned, but the knowledge that institutions can be wrong and individuals can be right, and sometimes you have to trust the people doing the fighting more than the people writing the regulations. The modified Mark XIV proved it. 7 U-boats and 1,600 Japanese ships proved it. Barb's train proved it.